The city never slept, its heartbeat pulsing through neon lights and the chatter of a million stories waiting to be told. But beneath the surface, hidden from the glowing facades and the crowd's excitement, was a reality far grimmer. The streets were lined with those who had been left behind, homeless, forgotten, invisible. It was in this world of shadows that Mike existed, a teenager with nothing but the street as his home and a hoodie to protect him from the elements. Life was a constant battle for survival, where every corner turned and every shadowed alley held the potential for danger or safety, depending on who walked through them. That night, the rain fell relentlessly, soaking everything in its path. People hurried past, their umbrellas shielding them from the downpour, their eyes glued to the ground, avoiding any distractions that might delay them. The streets were slick, a mirror to the city's polished surface, but beneath it, reality was raw and unforgiving. It was then that Mike saw Donald Trump, a man whose name was synonymous with power, wealth, and influence. Yet, at that moment, Trump wasn't the billionaire mogul or former president. He was just another figure lying in the rain, vulnerable and alone. Mike didn't hesitate. In his tattered hoodie and worn sneakers, he stepped forward. "Hey," he said, his voice cutting through the relentless sound of rain. "You need help." Trump stirred, his eyes fluttering open slowly. The confusion in them was palpable. His body was weak, his clothes dripping wet, and his presence at odds with the towering image he once commanded. "Why?" he rasped, his voice barely audible, more a breath than a sound. Mike didn't have a ready answer, nor did he need one. He simply offered the only warmth he had, a ragged hoodie that had been his shield against the cold for countless nights. "Because you're a person," Mike said softly, his voice steady despite the storm. "Just like me." In that moment, everything else faded away. The rain lost its noise. The city seemed to pause, and all that remained was two people connected by their shared humanity. There was no need for titles or status. It was raw, unfiltered, and real. Mike saw past the labels, the media portrayals, the divisions created by wealth and power. And Trump, lying there on the cold, wet ground, saw something different, a glimpse into the world of those he rarely acknowledged, those who lived without recognition, without shelter, without a voice in the systems that define success. "You shouldn't be out here," Trump said after a long silence, his voice rough but holding a surprising vulnerability. Mike crouched down to help him to his feet, his hands steady despite the rain soaking his sleeves. "Neither should you," he replied, the weight of his words carrying more than just the physical act of lifting him up. The world outside their bubble resumed its usual chaos. But for that brief moment, they shared a stillness that spoke louder than any words ever could. Mike and Trump were worlds apart, yet that moment erased the lines of division. It was a meeting of two lives, shaped by very different experiences. But in that moment of need, their humanity united them. Mike didn't think about who Trump was, what his name meant in the grand scheme of things. He saw only a man who had fallen, someone who, despite his towering achievements, needed help just as much as anyone else. And Trump? For the first time in a long time, he wasn't met with indifference. Instead, there was someone who saw him, really saw him, not as a former president or a celebrity, but as a person worthy of compassion. As they stood there, the rain began to slow, the city's lights shimmering in the distance. Mike led Trump to a nearby bench, where they sat together, sharing a quiet moment amidst the storm. The street that had always felt like a battlefield became a sanctuary, a space where two people, despite their differences, could simply be. "What now?" Trump asked after a while, his voice softer, more reflective. Mike glanced at him, his expression calm. "Now, we keep going," he said, "together, or not at all." They didn't know what the future held. The world didn't offer simple solutions, especially not in a city as complex and divided as theirs. But in that moment, standing side by side in the rain, they made an unspoken pact, a promise to move forward, to see the world differently, and to build something more than the walls that had been constructed to separate them. The rain had stopped by the time they stood up again. The city continued its relentless motion, but for a few precious hours, it had been quiet, and two people had shared a connection that would change both of their lives in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The rain had come unexpectedly that night, a cold, relentless downpour that had turned the streets into rivers. The city's usual hum was subdued, muffled by the relentless pounding of water on cobblestones and rooftops. Mike stood beneath the shelter of a crumbling awning, watching the world pass by in a blur. He had learned to move with the chaos, to to find pockets of safety amidst the storm. But this night felt different. It had been hours since he'd given away his only warm piece of clothing, a hoodie, the only thing that had kept him from shivering through the winter nights. He remembered the desperate look in the man's eyes, how his own instinct screamed to walk away, to keep moving, but something about the figure lying there, motionless and vulnerable, struck a chord deep within him. So, he stopped, a simple act of kindness, one born from understanding a shared struggle that few could truly grasp. The next morning, the streets were still damp, but the storm had passed. Mike found himself sitting in a small cafe, the warmth of the coffee in his hands grounding him, the events of the previous night replayed in his mind. He could still see the man lying there, the defiant yet fragile look in his eyes, his words that had resonated more than Mike cared to admit. "You stopped." It wasn't a question, but a statement, a weighty acknowledgement of the moment they shared. For someone like Trump, who had built a kingdom of influence, to say those words felt humbling in a way Mike hadn't expected. "Why did you really help me?" Trump had asked, his voice quieter now, more reflective than the persona Mike had seen on TV. Mike had answered truthfully, though his words had been guided by a mix of instinct and memory. "Your grandmother. She was the one who taught me. She always said your character is shown by how you treat those who can't offer anything in return." That night, I didn't see the billionaire or the former president. I just saw someone who needed help. Trump had paused, the weight of Mike's words pressing into the air between them. "She was a wise woman," he said softly, "the best person I ever knew." For Mike, it was never about notoriety or recognition. It was about surviving, about navigating a life that often felt invisible to the world. Yet, that night, beneath the rain, he had been seen, truly seen. And so, when Trump offered him a hand up, not just physically but figuratively, it wasn't about obligation or charity. It was an opportunity to bridge a gap between two worlds that had rarely intersected. As they sat in Trump's office, the stark contrast between their worlds was evident. Trump's space was one of polished luxury, a space designed for power, prestige, and distance. But in that moment, it felt stripped of its usual veneer, replaced by something more authentic. And despite the difference in wealth, status, and experience, a shared understanding began to form. "We need to build something," Trump had said, his voice tinged with determination. "Something that really addresses what these kids need, what you know they need." Mike had nodded, his mind racing through the possibilities. His lived experience on the streets had taught him that shelters and temporary solutions were only patches in a much larger system of neglect. True change required understanding, empathy, and involvement that went far beyond charity. One evening, after a long day of meetings and planning, Elon walked out into the crisp night air. His driver, Dave, waited at the curb, ready to take him home. But Elon paused, looking at his phone with a thoughtful expression. "I have one more stop," he said, surprising even himself. "Maria's apartment." Dave guessed. Elon nodded, a small smile forming at the corner of his mouth. When Maria opened the door this time, the difference was unmistakable. Her face was brighter, more at ease. The apartment, though not grand, felt full of life, filled with warmth and possibilities. "You didn't have to come again," Maria said, though there was no trace of annoyance, only genuine gratitude. Elon chuckled softly. "Maybe not, but it's become part of the routine. Checking in, seeing how things are." Maria offered him a seat at the kitchen table. They talked for hours about everything, from the progress at Tesla to dreams for the future. Elena joined them after a while, knitting gently while listening, her eyes no longer weary, but hopeful. For the first time, Elon felt like part of something bigger than himself. It wasn't about leading from behind a desk or making decisions in a vacuum. It was about being present, about seeing the impact of those decisions up close. As the evening wound down, Elon stood to leave, a sense of contentment settling over him. "Keep letting me see through your eyes," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Because every time you do, we change the world." Maria smiled, squeezing Elena's hand tightly. They watched him leave, the door closing behind him as hope lingered in the still air of their apartment. For them, and for countless others, the future looked brighter. And as Elon walked back to his car, his mind already racing with the next steps for Tesla, he knew the journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. By the time the first Johnson Trump Youth Center opened its doors, the foundation had created a model of support that was deeply personal and profoundly effective. There were no empty promises, no surface-level solutions, just real help, real change. And Mike, standing in that newly constructed building, felt a profound sense of achievement. It wasn't about his name on a building or accolades for his involvement. It was about the countless lives that had been touched, changed, and uplifted because of a single act of kindness and a shared understanding of what it truly meant to be human. As he looked out at the students and young adults moving through the center, laughing, learning, and finding safety, Mike knew that the ripple effect had begun. And somewhere in the city, beneath the ever-moving lights, there were more stories waiting to unfold, a testament to the power of empathy, action, and the simple act of seeing. The sun began to rise, casting long shadows over the city, a stark contrast to the previous night's storm. The Johnson Trump Youth Center buzzed with energy, a place where stories of resilience and transformation were now being written. Mike sat quietly in his corner, watching the students interact, sharing meals, and supporting one another. It wasn't just a space for shelter or resources. It was a home, a community, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Across the city, news of the foundation began to spread. What started as a simple act of kindness had evolved into something far greater, a movement to address the systemic issues that perpetuated youth homelessness. Mike and Trump had built a legacy together, but it wasn't one built on fame or accolades. It was a legacy of impact, of lives touched, of barriers broken. One day, while working late at the center, Mike received an unexpected visitor. Trump himself had come to see how things were progressing. "How's it going?" Trump asked with a genuine smile, his voice calm and reflective. "It's good," Mike responded, offering him a chair. "But there's still a long way to go." Trump nodded, leaning back. "That's always the case. Change doesn't come easily. But you're doing something special here, Mike. You're changing lives." Mike smiled, but the weight of the work never left him. "It's not just me," he said. "It's the kids. They found a place where they can be heard, where they know they're not alone." Trump took a moment, studying Mike's expression. "I've seen a lot in my life, Mike. The highs, the lows, the times when you feel like everything is falling apart. But this," he gestured around, "this is real. This is what matters." Their conversation drifted into reflections on their journey, from a rainy night on the street to a foundation that spanned cities. The contrast was vast, yet the core remained the same, a desire to create lasting change. Outside the center, the city continued its rhythm, cars honking, people moving hurriedly through streets. But inside, a sense of peace lingered. This wasn't just a place of refuge, it was a sanctuary for hope. In the evenings, Mike often sat with the kids, listening to their stories. There were moments of laughter, moments of tears, but through it all, there was growth, a recognition of what they could achieve together. Many who once felt invisible were now thriving, given the tools and the support they needed to build a future of their own design. Meanwhile, Trump remained a part of the journey. His involvement shifted from a distant benefactor to a true ally, someone who understood the complexities of systemic issues and worked tirelessly to remove obstacles rather than simply fund programs. His name wasn't plastered everywhere, but his actions spoke volumes. News outlets occasionally covered the foundation's progress, but Mike remained focused on the work at hand. The spotlight wasn't necessary when real change was the goal. "The media will come and go," he told the kids one evening, "but what we're building here is for the long haul." Trump's visits became less frequent, but no less meaningful. Each time, he brought new ideas, new resources, and new partnerships. Yet, more than anything, he brought his unwavering commitment. The foundation began to collaborate with other organizations, pooling resources, sharing insights, and expanding their reach. Together, they developed programs tailored to specific challenges: mental health support, job training, educational initiatives, all underpinned by the philosophy that every person deserved to be seen, heard, and valued. Mike's role continued to evolve. He wasn't just leading the foundation, he was living it. The lessons he learned on the streets, the empathy he cultivated through shared experiences, became the foundation of his leadership. "It's about trust," he often said. "Without it, you're just spinning your wheels." As years passed, the foundation remained steadfast. Thousands of lives had been transformed, and yet the work was far from over. Cities across the country were reaching out for support, eager to replicate what had been done in the birthplace of the Johnson Trump Youth Center. One day, Mike received a letter, a simple, heartfelt note from a young woman who had once called the streets her home. She thanked him for being there, for believing in her when no one else did, for showing her that there was a future worth fighting for. "You saw me," she wrote. And because of that, I see myself now. Mike placed the letter down, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't just about the numbers, the programs, or the grand plans. It was about the stories, the moments when someone found their voice, their strength, and a sense of purpose. As he looked around the center, at the staff, volunteers, and the youth who continued to inspire change, Mike knew the impact of what they had built together was undeniable. The bond formed from a rainy night, a connection forged through vulnerability and humanity, had created a legacy far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. And though the world outside remained complex and often harsh, inside the walls of the Johnson Trump Youth Center, there was hope, a light that refused to be extinguished by adversity.